It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome Rajiv, who I consider both a friend and, of course, a colleague to the Washington, D.C. area. Rajiv is also, like many of you, a scientist, a computer scientist and a physicist, but 20 years ago decided to devote his life to the study of India, Indian civilization, and Indian spiritual traditions. He was, of course, a very successful entrepreneur prior to that, and I guess that success has sort of allowed you to spend the next sort of phase of your life in doing the work that you have. He's been an author and is a prolific writer. He blogs. He's very popular in the blogosphere, and Huffington Post and Pathos and First Post and State of Formation, and on it goes. So for those of you who haven't heard of him, you only have to Google his name to find out all about him. His most recent book, Being Different, the one that he's going to talk about today, is really sort of the distillation of his 20 years of study and serious scholarship. He also, by the way, happens to run his own foundation called the Infinity Foundation. Being Different essentially brings to the foreground the elements that make India and Indian civilization distinct from other parts of the world, but specifically the West. And in the book, it's interesting, it's fascinating. I read the manuscript a couple of years ago for the first time, and I was absolutely riveted because as an Indian, even though I've sort of grown up in India, born and raised in India, have lived in this country for quite a long time, I just felt that I had never heard or seen in writing what being Indian really means and articulate it as well as it is. And what was particularly interesting was sort of the comparison that Rajiv presents with the West, and sort of being bicultural and having lived here and being Indian American. That was of great interest to me. So Rajiv will certainly talk to you much more about the book. It is important to know that he's had, the book is already a bestseller. It's been out for 2 months, and it's a bestseller in India. It's been in waves. But one of the audiences, a couple of the audiences that have been really interested in the book, which should interest this group here, is the technical scientist, the scientific community in India has found Being Different to be of great interest to what they do and to their knowledge of India. The business community has found it very interesting as well. And I'm sure many of you here sort of combine business with technology, and you will find, and Rajiv will talk about this a lot more, that in his book he sort of explains that there is a very distinct Indian way of doing business and of thinking through scientific issues. And I think this book is great, not just for Indians, but also for Westerners who are trying to know more about India. So with that, Rajiv, welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay.
I was hosted at IIT Madras in November. We had a session on this book, and a couple of professors came in, gave their comments and discussions, and a whole evening with student Q&A. And more recently, IIT Kharagpur, spent an evening there. I've also given talks at Indian Institute of Sciences in Bangalore. In terms of management, it was mentioned, management people are very interested. So there was a seminar at IIM Bangalore, and also there's an worldwide organization called the Young Presidents Organization, YPO. These are presidents of a company before the age of 40, and they have chapters all over. And the YPO of Chennai hosted, and then the YPO of Calcutta hosted. So I've been around, and in the recent trip I went to the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, which, as you know, is the brain trust of nuclear science and all that, and have a wonderful evening with scientists. I wasn't sure how interested they would be in matters of civilization and culture, but they were extremely interested, and it came out in the Q&A. And they pulled more out during the Q&A than I was presenting myself. So since my background is as a scientist and then in the business world, and I decided to sort of go into a journey of self-discovery and self-exploration, not only about my own personal life, but also me as an Indian, and see what is distinct, who are we, and what do we bring to the world. That's important. So the primary audience of all my writings is actually myself. I'm trying to write to clarify my own ideas, and then the sharing with other people became a kind of a natural offshoot. Started with presentations and blogs, and then people started wanting more articles and books, and so books started coming, and that's how I ended up here. I didn't leave the business world with the thought that I'm going to become a writer, but it sort of evolved that way. Now my theme has always been, in this 20 years, has been the things about India, its civilization, its history, its spirituality, its culture, those sort of things. And I found a whole lot of ignorance, misunderstanding, misinterpretation in the US school systems. One of the books there, called Invading the Sacred, was a book about distortions and stereotypes, basically stereotypes in the school system. A lot of it unintended, just out of ignorance, because that's how during the colonial era we were typecast. And then I've written more books. The most recent one, which is what I want to talk about, Being Different, is about the question, what is there about the Indian mind and the Indian tradition which is radically different from the Western worldview. Now there is a term I use called Western universalism, which means that the West's idea of history, philosophy, science, values, because of the West's power, became universal. So the education system, which spread into places like India, being Western influenced, people there started thinking that this is the universal gold standard. And so people in the former colonies like India evaluate their own culture against the West as the gold standard. And they sort of aren't sufficiently educated or aware of their own civilization to be able to reverse the process and say, okay, according to our gold standard, how are they? So there's some interesting things that are worth talking about in that regard. China is contesting Western universalism. China has come up with the idea of Confucian thought and Confucian universalism. Confucian universalism is a term they've coined, Confucian ethics, Confucian modernity, and what they mean is that we are becoming modern, but that doesn't mean we have to become Western. We can remain Chinese and follow our traditional philosophy of the Confucian way, and within the parameters of our Confucian way, we can also be as modern and scientific and technological as anybody else. So we intend to be number one in all these domains, but the Chinese-ness remains. And the Japanese never ceased to be Japanese, even though they came up with the best technology and science in so many ways. And you find that even in Europe, the French are very French. They are very distinct about what it means to be French, and don't like it if you mix them up with an Englishman or say it's all the same. They don't like that. And Russian is very clear about what's the history and the whole mindset of being a Russian. So the question keeps coming up, and a lot of business people want to ask me, as now they're going around the world cutting deals, they're finding out that when they do a deal involving a Chinese, he's very clear about his sense of identity. The Japanese is very clear, the French guy is very clear, the British guy is very clear. So who are we in terms of our civilizational identity? And the idea that we sort of melt and give up and surrender and sort of join Western universalism, we may think that that is the universalism, but all these other places I mentioned don't think so. They are very clear about their own distinctiveness. And distinctiveness is not necessarily superiority, it just means we're different. It just means that we're this way, and somebody else is some other way. It's not a question of superior or inferior, it's just a question of wanting to honor and respect one's own distinctiveness. Now, if you look at the history, one of the things I'm doing is my foundation has started a 20-volume series on history of Indian contributions to science and technology. Somebody called Joseph Needham did 30 volumes in Cambridge. He did 30 volumes on Chinese science and technology, and every university studying China looks at that as a reference work. Nobody had done something similar for India, so we decided we should do it. We have 9 volumes done, and we have a few more in the pipeline. If you look at the history of Indian science and technology, it's filled with a huge amount of pioneering work in things like metallurgy, steel, zinc distillation, which was pioneered in India, textiles, shipbuilding, water harvesting, civil engineering, on and on. There's several fields in which Indians did extremely well, and this is quite well documented. And you might be thinking that this phenomenon of Indian technocrats and highly skilled knowledge workers going to other countries is something recent, as if it's happened for the first time. But I'd like to tell you that this is also a very common trend in the early centuries. You see many Arab sources talking about Indian physicians in their hospitals, Indian astronomers, Indian knowledge workers. You see China importing a whole lot of Indian knowledge workers into China with great respect, bringing them as sort of distinguished thinkers. So the export of India, its knowledge workers, has been around for a very long time. The earliest records in Greece and Rome talk about importing Indian steel, a kind of steel called Wood's steel, W-O-O-T-Z steel, which was very tough, and that was used for making weapons and swords and shields because you couldn't pierce it. And it was sold like gold, it was very valuable, and only India had that technology. So you find quite a lot of export of knowledge workers and technology. A person in University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, where I'm on the chair of the governing board for the India Studies program, a person there who's a historian of Portugal went to find out more about the Portuguese trade in Goa. And he wanted to find out how did they make such a huge empire with a little colony there, why were they there, what were they doing. And he had the Indian government open up various old archives which nobody had bothered to read. And he found that the major item of trade was medicinal plants. So India, what has been classified as spices is actually medicinal plants. It's not that somebody is, taking some regular spice. You wouldn't build an empire out of that. But these were medicinal plants. And Portugal was importing this and re-exporting, supplying most of Europe. So Portugal was sort of the middleman, bringing these things and supplying most of Europe. You find that places like Nalanda University and 20 other universities in North India were like today's Harvard or MIT or Stanford. They were attracting the brightest of the brightest from all over Asia, not imposing or conquering or going there with an army to impose on them and put the Indian ideas on others, but actually people from other countries were soliciting this knowledge. The emperors in China were routinely sending the cream to places in India for higher knowledge. Southeast Asia, places like Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, were not only sending their smartest kids to learn, but also were endowing colleges and endowing programs in places like Nalanda because they were so appreciative of what they were getting in return. And though all the Nalanda University library was destroyed by invaders, the knowledge about Nalanda that we have today is reconstructed from foreign students' records. So you have Chinese foreign students who came and studied there for many years, and students from various countries, And when they went back in their own languages, they have written diaries which got published, which have been preserved. So so there's a multi-volume series on Nalanda, what was its curriculum, what was life like, who were the faculty, and that is reconstructed from foreign students' accounts. So this shows that India as a knowledge economy, which is a buzzword nowadays, knowledge economy, is not necessarily something very recent. It has been there for a while. And you find that the oldest city, known cities or complex of cities, the Harappan, Indus Valley, Saraswati civilization, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Dholavira is in Gujarat, is an amazing, amazing feat. And we've done a few volumes of that in our foundation and plan to do a few more. And the former Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, who passed away a few years ago, he was the editorial board of the series. He's the person who actually discovered Dholavira, which is the world's oldest port. And when you look at the civilization, it has over 2,000 settlements, 2,000 towns and villages, some big, some small, spread over an area half the size of Europe. So it's a very large place. And from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Punjab, Rajasthan, Gujarat kind of place, right up to Delhi. And this civilization lasts over 2,000 years. So you have a huge civilization scattered, lasting a very long time. And you see the technology of tiles, you see the technology of weights. They have binary weights. The weights are the ratio of 1:2:4:8 and so on. So binary weights. The length, width, height of the tiles also binary ratio. And yet there is no evidence that this was centrally administered and centrally controlled. It's very decentralized because you have a whole lot of towns which seem self-contained. It is not like in other civilizations like Mesopotamia or Egypt, where you have one big emperor's big fortress where the emperor lived, and then everybody else is living in tents. It's not like that. There is no one big fortress, first of all. So there is no huge center with a lot of power or a lot of wealth. It's all decentralized, one bedroom, two bedroom flats, like a middle class, like a very egalitarian middle class. So we keep hearing about, our society being very hierarchical forever. But the physical evidence of archaeology from the Harappan civilization doesn't show that to be the case. When it happened, why it happened, we don't know. But certainly at that time, it seemed to be a very flat society with a whole lot of people more or less equal, with running water, drainage systems. Very interesting. So we are doing this kind of work to understand our civilization better. This also refutes a myth that Indians are mystical and otherworldly, and they neglect this world, and they're not materialistic, and they're all spiritual, and they're not interested in material welfare, because you don't find that. You find the medicine improving over time, the medicine practice. You find steel manufacturing improving over time. You find the cities becoming more sophisticated over time. So you find that the idea of advancement is definitely there, and the idea of looking after society's needs is definitely there. So while we have a great spiritual tradition also, it is not that there hasn't been a material civilization as well. So this is kind of interesting. One of the reasons I wanted to embark on this very ambitious 20-volume project is to refute the claim that the Indian philosophy will require Westerners to come and rescue us and save us, because we will become kind of imbeciles and incapable of really helping ourselves in a material sense. If you look at his history until the colonial era, the history is quite prosperous in India in a material sense. The Cambridge history of world economics looks at all the civilizations and how they were doing at various points in time, and it says that until 1750, India was 24-25% of the world GDP, and China was about the same, a little higher. So more than 50% of the world GDP was India and China. And what is called the West which consists of Europe and United States, was less than 10% at that point in time. And 100 years later, the West became like 70–80% from less than 10. That's called the Industrial Revolution. And India went down to 3–4%. So there is a 100-year period of de-industrialization of India and the industrialization of Europe. It's a very interesting mathematical correlation. So while you read about the Industrial Revolution of England, it is always shown as some kind of a great event that they did it on their own, and they were somehow superior people, and they figured out all of this. And the role of the colonies in supplying the wealth, in supplying the technology, in supplying sometimes the labor, and being the market for finished goods is seldom mentioned. But actually, if you look at the 1800s records, the British made very concerted efforts to ban steel production in India, to really go and persecute people who were textile manufacturers when these technologies were being relocated and ramped up in the British Industrial Revolution. So when people talk about India as a developing economy, I prefer the term redeveloping, because redeveloping shows that it already had some advancement, it already had some prosperity, and there was a decline, and now it's trying to have a renaissance, come back. So whereas development makes it look like it was all sort of dark and primitive and tribal and backward, and now West is coming to civilize. So I think that linear theory of history, which is a Hegelian idea, that everybody goes through the same stages that the West went through, and the non-West is sort of backward. They are where the West used to be, and they have to, in order to bring them up, they have to copy the West and become like the West. So, and the West is always going to be ahead of them. I mean, that is just not true. If you look at the facts, that's just not true. So some of the scientific claims are quite impressive from the Indian tradition. And I'm not referring to things that can't be proven. In our series, we don't include things like a claim that there was flying saucers in the Mahabharata or something, Pushpak Viman. Because when somebody asks me, I had a big fight with orthodox thinkers who say, okay, why aren't you including, aircraft which are mentioned in the Mahabharata? I tell them that I need physical evidence. I mean, you need to show me a plane or a wheel or a wing, or you need to show a landing strip, or you need to show me something. Because a scientist wants empirical proof. Just because someone wrote it, it could have been fiction, could have been imagination, could have been a proposal which nobody implemented. I mean, there's so many architectural proposals that never get implemented. So maybe it was somebody's wild imagination. But whether they really existed or not, you can't prove until you can show evidence. Then in Mahabharata, there's also talk about, people say there's talk about nuclear bombs. So I always tell them that, and I told this to people in Bhabha Atomic Research, because they're all nuclear scientists. I said, if there was a nuclear bomb, there would be a radioactive crater. So somebody has to take me to a place with a Geiger counter and say there was a nuclear bomb because there's a radioactive crater, and no one has shown us that. So I can't believe that. So I'm a very skeptical, scientific mind. I don't accept things just because it is nostalgia or chauvinistic, or I don't believe in that kind of stuff. I'm a pretty hard-nosed scientific mind. And applying that standard, I find some amazing contributions that withstand scientific scrutiny. For example, there is a Sanskrit text where it says this particular formula gives you the velocity of light. And that velocity of light is exceedingly accurate. It's not the most accurate as per today, but it is like 99% accurate. Now, how would somebody have any idea about the velocity of light? There is no evidence that there was a measuring instrument at that time. There's no evidence, no claim that they measured it. But how did somebody intuit, or where did he get this idea from? We don't know. But we cannot deny that there is such a thing. And similarly, the value of pi, very accurately written. So a whole lot of these calculations, these theories are verifiable today, but we do not understand how someone figured this out. At least as of now, we don't understand. There's a lot on the mathematics, infinite series, the idea of infinitesimal, things that are required prerequisites for calculus. A few hundred years before Descartes and Newton start using these things, mathematicians in Kerala and various other places in India are filled with volumes of this sort of thing. And Bodhanya's theorem predates the Pythagoras theorem by several centuries, and in fact is a more general theorem, of which the Pythagoras theorem is a special case. So if you look at all this, the question is, a question that comes up is, how did the Indian scientific mind make these discoveries? And one of the things I discuss in one of the chapters, I believe chapter 4, is is there an Indian way of science? And I raised this question at the Bhabha Atomic Research, and it generated a fantastic discussion during Q&A and later on over dinner. I was very fascinated by exploring these kind of ideas. Then another area of Indian knowledge which is seldom appreciated, because the only knowledge given credit is sort of spiritual, mystical knowledge, which is of course very profound, but another area which is practical is the whole area of value for society. People are generally not, when they study the Indian traditions, they are not studying Natya-shastra, which is the aesthetics, the theory of dance, the theory of arts, which is very sophisticated. Often people are not studying Kautilya, and the whole Arthashastra, which is several thousand years before, people like, the political scientists of the West, Machiavelli, a lot of people like Machiavelli, way before Europeans. Political thought, very practical thought. Theories of ethics, theories of statecraft and governance. The caring for elderly in the ashrama system, very deeply rooted ideas on looking after the elderly, your responsibility towards the elderly in society, your responsibility towards animals. Now we have animal rights in the West, but this is a very recent thing. But in India it's a very ancient system, and your responsibility towards Mother Nature. We have ecology and environmentalism, more so from a selfish point of view, because like if we dump pollutants into the water, the fish will go bad, it's bad for our economy, or if we pollute the atmosphere, it'll be bad for our health. It's not as if nature has her own rights, it's more like for our selfish needs, we better look after our asset. Nature is our asset, our property, and it's not that we are respecting nature as herself, we are really respecting it as our property, looking after for our own purpose. But in our traditions, nature has rights. Nature has rights. Nature is a living entity, and you have an obligation of duties towards preserving and looking after nature. So the ethics are not only about myself, also about family, what in the West is called family values, also particular duties towards the elderly, towards society, towards animals, towards the whole cosmos. This is very interesting, this kind of a thing. And some of these ideas from India entered the West in the 1960s, when there were hippies and there was the New Age movement, and a lot of people going to India for answers. Then they brought back some of these ideas. The idea of the divine as feminine was an Indian idea brought into in the 60s and 70s into the West. So India has had an influence in what is now considered new Western thought. And sometimes, there's a book club which has just featured this book. Lively debates have started. And so some of the Westerners' critique of my book is that when you point out differences, you are ignoring that many Westerners have had similar thoughts. And then they name Whitehead, and they name Teilhard de Chardin, and I point out that every one of them actually studied India. Every one of them brought these ideas from India. So these ideas of Indian origin got recharacterized, reformulated. The original Sanskrit got dropped, and they got put into a Western framework and called Western thought. And so now you're using the Indian thought, Westernized, as your argument against me. So this is a very interesting discussion I'm also having. Today, the cutting edge of neuroscience and cognitive science in MIT labs, National Institute of Mental Health, people in Stanford, people in Harvard. A lot of that is based on the study of yogis and Tibetan meditators. This has been going on for 25 years because by studying the higher states of consciousness that these traditional systems are able to achieve, they are finding neurological phenomena which were previously not considered to be possible. So there's something called functional MRIs which allow you to do very, very sophisticated scans inside the brain and figure out how the system is shifting when the person is practicing some technique. So the unfortunate thing which I'm criticizing is that the Westerner who measures the yogi gets to claim credit as his discovery, not the yogi who can produce that. So the argument I give is it's like an athlete who runs a very fast 100 meters and the guy with the stopwatch gets a medal. That, and you call the athlete a subject, like a rat or something. The subject achieved this and I measured it, so I get a paper and I get a prize for it. So this is what's happening. Herb Benson in Harvard studied transcendental meditators in the 70s, 60s and 70s. And he wanted to take credit for discovery, so he called it the relaxation response rather than transcendental meditation. But all the people he was studying were transcendental meditators. He knows that, everybody knows that. And so he came up with a huge empire at Harvard, big grants he got, and he's celebrated as sort of the founding discoverer of this phenomenon. Yeah? And then Vipassana meditation, which many of you might know about, has been trademarked mindfulness meditation by John Kabat-Zinn. So in Massachusetts Hospital and in the US Department of Health and all that, FDA, all these kind of guys, they are looking at the scientific claims, the scientific benefits, medical benefits of John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness meditation. So some Indian doctors of mine, friends of mine, one day at a party was saying, I've come to this, I've learned this great mindfulness meditation and I can apply it in my practice and I can solve this problem, that problem. And I said, this is an Indian thing. It's called Vipassana. And the guy is having a fight with me because I'm sort of bringing down the greatness of what he's learned by telling him that this is your grandfather's tradition. And he's rejected all that. He's rejected his ancestry. And he's now learning this from Westerners and with some nice jargon and some nice new technology, techniques and all that. So, but it's the same principle, and this has now become fashionable. There is an old technique called Yoga Nidra. Yoga Nidra is a state of consciousness where your body is sleeping, but you're alert. So you are awake, very tranquil, there's no thought, very peaceful. It's like very silent witness, very calm, no activity, but witness, awake. And you're observing, you're even observing your breathing, you can be observing your snoring. Yeah, it's a very amazing kind of a thing that you can get into. And there's a Stephen LaBerge in Stanford who studied this for many years and he called it lucid dreaming. And he trademarked lucid dreaming and set up many institutes in different parts of the world to study, do R&D on lucid dreaming. So he's become a very big shot, gets a lot of grants, and he's considered a pioneer. And when he was giving a talk in the 90s about all this, after the talk I went to ask him that, this is an Indian thing. This is Yoga Nidra. So he was very nervous. He said, of course, and he started telling me how he knows this Swami and that place, and he lived in India for 20 years, and he learned it here and there. So I said, why don't you tell that to the audience? And he says, because then I'll never get a grant, it'll be considered some quackery, it'll be, nobody will give me a grant, it will not be considered science, it'll be, so I have to, you should be grateful, I'm doing you a favor because I'm giving the Western stamp of approval, as if we are getting a benefit if somebody takes our things and puts a stamp of their certificate on it. So we have to be grateful for that. So those are some of the episodes I just gave you, which led me into this path of trying to understand and recover and rediscover. So the purpose of this is severalfold. First benefit is that if you can reconnect what the West has found useful and validated in modern scientific terms, if you can reconnect the Indian traditional origin of this, then you can go back to that origin and see what else is there which they did not discover. Because, you know, when somebody comes to your house and takes your art and puts his name on it and hangs it somewhere, maybe there's more art, maybe there's more value, maybe he didn't discover everything. And indeed it is the case that they have a kind of a surface knowledge of something, very useful, and they've gone running to the bank and claiming credit that they've discovered something. But if you go back to that tradition and revive it, there is, you know, 100 times more left to be discovered. So that's one advantage. Second advantage is self-alienated Indians with an inferiority complex. The way you can turn it around is to say that, look, these are all kinds of things that others are appreciating, others are getting value, why are you rejecting this? So this is kind of like reverse psychology, and it works on some people. And third is to make Westerners more self-conscious about their moral responsibility. And I call it when you harvest the fruit from a tree, you must nurture the roots. You harvest the fruits, you must feed the roots, because you got something out of that tree, you must give something back for the next year's harvest. If you keep harvesting the fruit and don't nurture the roots, let the roots atrophy, the roots will die, and it'll be myopic. Now, one of the things that I've been asked to do by some people in India is a number of people in India are interested in taking these traditional Indian knowledge ideas and finding applications for solving today's problems. So for instance, water is a very serious problem, and I'm glad that the program called WHEELS starts with W, which is water. I saw a satellite picture in India where there's a certain camera that can tell you moisture so many feet below the ground. So ponds, artificial water wells and ponds and lakes that had been dug up traditionally, which have been covered up with dirt and which have been used as dumping grounds and, you know, become abused, can be detected by satellite. And there's over 1 million man-made water bodies in India that the satellite images can tell you. I saw one in a detailed map in Tamil Nadu, where what they showed was there's a river, and that river floods. There's 100 hours in the whole year when 90% of the rainfall comes in 100 hours. This is what they discovered. If you do a distribution of rainfall hourly, then if you pick the heaviest rain hours, top 100, which is like 4 days, gives you 90% of the rainfall. This is like high concentration of rainfall. So naturally, there's a flood, and all this water goes waste, and rest of the year there's not enough water. So what these people had done traditionally is when the river would overflow, they had along the river several man-made lakes. And then when these lakes would overflow, they had a second row of lakes. And when the second row of lakes would overflow, they had a third row of lakes. So they have as many as 10 rows of lakes. So each, upon overflowing, there's a little canal, little trench that feeds over to the next level and the next level and the next level. Very, very interesting. And then these fill up, and even till the next year, you've got enough water around for storage purposes. So that's an example of a technology. We're also looking at sustainability. You know, the GDP growth rate based on very intensive use of raw material, energy, very intensive use of fossil fuels, and very intensive use of other raw material is not sustainable. We have 7 billion people on the planet. They are now thinking it will not level off at 12 or something. They thought it would. It may go up to 15 by the end of this century. So where will the raw material, the energy, the capital, the land for growing food, where will that come from with such a high density of population all over the world? I mean, this is a question for a new kind of approach to science and technology. We cannot just go on imagining that everybody becomes like an American. If 300, 400 million Americans have a certain density of automobiles, per 100 people there's a certain density of automobiles. If 1.2 billion people in India want to achieve the same density of automobiles in 1/3 the amount of land, the density of automobiles will be such that India will become a parking lot. The whole India will be like a big parking lot. I mean, even 20 lanes, 40 lanes roads will not be enough because the sheer population is too much. So obviously, the wrong strategy is to mimic the United States, because India does not have the same situation and must, come up with very different priorities on how you give a good lifestyle. So there is a role for Indian ways of thinking and Indian traditions in order to figure out what's a more balanced and sensible, sustainable, achievable thing. Because if every Indian is craving to become like an American, is measuring with the American as the gold standard, you will have a lot of frustrated people, you will have a lot of disillusioned people, you'll have a lot of haves and have-nots defined based on who's how American, who's how less American. And that criteria and that yardstick will tear society apart, will be violence and all kinds of social unrest. So what you need is something that is achievable on a very large scale, scalable. The American model of prosperity and modernity is not scalable on the world scale. You cannot have the whole world of 15 billion people in the future all living the kind of per capita consumption of paper. We have such a high per capita consumption of so many things in this country. It's just not possible. So there are needs for alternative models and alternative ways of thinking. And I'll close by introducing one more concept which is in this book, and that is the concept called digestion. I introduced the idea of digestion of one civilization into another. It's like a predator, like a tiger eats a deer, and then the deer vanishes. There's no more deer left because the tiger breaks down the deer's DNA into little parts, and then all that is reassembled, all that is used as raw material, and in the tiger's body it's reassembled into tiger's DNA. And so the tiger has skin and blood and flesh and whatever, all with tiger DNA in it. There's no more deer DNA left. So that is what happens when somebody gets digested. What was considered undesirable about the deer is either left out, like skin and teeth, they're not taken in, or if they're taken in, they're excreted as waste because they're of no use. Now, if you take this kind of model, civilizations have been digested in the past. The Native Americans were digested. Many useful things were taken from them, but the Native Americans perished and they just preserved in museums, and you can go there and glorify how great they were, but they're not a living, thriving civilization today. Pre-Christian pagans in Greece and Rome and across Europe were persecuted. A lot of things were taken, like the Christmas tree and the mother child and the Easter, and a whole lot of symbols and rituals, and all these ideas were taken. What was considered useful, what was interesting, was adopted, but the pagans themselves were put away. So this has happened to Egyptians, this has happened to African cultures, and today Tibet is being digested into China. Same way, Tibet is being digested. In another generation or two, it will be a tourist attraction, there will be nice museums, there will be no living, thriving Tibetans. The only thing that's prevented them from finishing off the job is because there's a whole lot of Tibetan diaspora outside the Chinese control. Because if there weren't the Tibetan diaspora outside of China, they would have finished it off by now. So the digestion of a civilization by a stronger civilization has been happening a lot. And my concern is that if Indian knowledge keeps getting broken down by the predator, by the neuroscientists, by the cognitive scientists, by the people who want the patents, who don't want to acknowledge the source because they want to eliminate that trace, who want to claim it's theirs. This digestion of Indian knowledge and Indian traditions into what I call Western universalism will basically result in the destruction of a civilization. So it will not be a living civilization, it will just be sitting in museums for scholars. And the antidote to being digested is to understand what's distinct and different about us that we must preserve. What is it that is of use It's not just for nostalgia kind of a thing. What is it that's useful today, that is distinct about our civilization, that's the signature of our civilization, that's the DNA of our civilization, that we must understand, and then we must preserve it as something we cannot negotiate away. We cannot just give this up. And this book, Being Different, has identified 4 major areas of what these differences are. I don't have time to get into all that, but there's a chapter on each one of those 4. So chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, each of them takes one major area of difference and explains it in detail. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions.